All right, well, good afternoon, all. My name is Chris Kojum. I direct the Leadership, Ethics, and Practice Initiative at the Elliott School of International Affairs at GW, and I'm absolutely delighted to host today's event, which is with Mr. Marvin Kalb, the preeminent diplomatic correspondent of his generation, and he will have a conversation with Frank Sesno of the School of Media and Public Affairs, where Frank served for 11 years as the director and still is the director of strategic initiatives at the school. This event, we are happy to say, is co-hosted by the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Elliott School, and by the School of Media and Public Affairs, as I just mentioned, and also with co-hosted by my good friend, Mr. Walter Reich, who is the director of the Rabin Chair Forum. And Walter, over to you, and I'm so looking forward to this event.
And I've been looking forward to it for quite a while myself. It's an honor to be a co-host of this event and on behalf of the Rabin Chair Forum and everybody who admires Marvin Kalb and also Frank Sesno. Welcome.
Well, perhaps that's my cue to say thank you to you both and to welcome Marvin Kalb to this wonderful conversation. For many, many years, I have loved listening to Marvin Kalb and occasionally answering his questions, and now I am eager to ask him a few. Marvin is the author of this wonderful book, which I have read and I highly recommend it, Assignment Russia, Becoming a Foreign Correspondent in the Crucible of the Cold War. And that's what we will be talking about, among other things. But for those of you who may not know, and all should and probably all do, Marvin was an esteemed correspondent who really broke the mold at CBS, being hired by and then learning from the best. We'll be talking about that. Also at NBC, where he was moderator of Meet the Press. And I think, Marvin, we figured out that you were maybe the third moderator in what is the longest running show on television.
I think it was the third, I'm not sure.
Marvin enjoys affiliations and has enjoyed affiliations since with the Brookings Institution, the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting. He was the founding director of the Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy. He leads and continues to lead the Kalb Report, which I hope you have all seen. And Marvin, there's another season of the Kalb Report upcoming, is that right?
Yes, indeed. We just got the money.
Congratulations on that. So we look forward to that. And so we will launch into our conversation. To those of you who are joining us in the audience now, we welcome and we invite your questions for Marvin, whether it's on what he wrote about here, his time in the Soviet Union at a critical moment, which is included in his book, or any other thoughts that he may have on journalism, and we'll start to go there. So Marvin, with your indulgence, we will dive in.
Let's dive.
Okay. Well, so I read your book and I am fascinated by it as a journalist myself and somebody who studies this strange career, but also as someone having covered the White House and been to superpower summits, was just riveted by your conversations and your descriptions of these events. But let's start in the beginning, like how you got into this. I mean, here you were, and you write about this wonderfully in this book. You're a PhD candidate, you're a student at Harvard, you're studying Russian history, you're on this tremendous academic trajectory. And what happened?
Well, let me tell you, and you will be one of those who will understand immediately what I'm getting at. I was a couple of months away from completing my PhD in Russian history. I had done my orals. I was close to finishing a draft of the dissertation. I had been alerted in advance that the draft would be accepted, so I was on my way. And I was going to teach Russian history. It was very much on my mind. I loved the idea of teaching. I enjoyed immense. Then I did an article for the New York Times Magazine on Soviet youth. Came out, of course, on a Sunday. Edward R. Murrow, the great journalist at CBS, read it, apparently liked it. And on Monday morning, when I was at the library at Harvard, the Widener Library, a librarian came over to me and said, there's a man on the phone who would like to talk to you. He says he's Edward R. Murrow. Would you like to talk to him? And I said to the librarian, Edward R. Murrow is not interested in talking to me. Let's make that very clear. He's probably some quack. Just hang up on him.
You didn't say that.
Oh, I did say it, but I don't know whether she did it. But in any case, I went back to doing what I was doing. She came back to me late in the afternoon and said, Marvin, the same man is on the phone and he says he's Edward R. Murrow, and I think you really ought to pick up the phone and talk to him. So I thought it would be a waste of time, but I picked up the phone. And Frank, the minute I heard his voice, which was so distinctive, I realized what a total jackass I had been. And I apologized profusely. And he called me professor, I remember, and that stuck. He always referred to me, excuse me, as a professor. And he said, would you come down and talk to me tomorrow morning? I said, where? He said, New York. I said, I'll be there. I was there a half hour in advance. 9 o'clock, the meeting started. The secretary said, remember, Ed, you're very busy, half hour at the most. He said, yes. And we talked for 3 hours. Murrow was
how old at this point? How old are you?
I was 27. And on my way, as I said, to being a teacher. Murrow calls, I go down to see him, 3 hours of conversation, after which he puts his arm around my shoulder. And he says, oh, by the way, I forgot to ask, how would you like to join CBS?
Just like that.
Just like that. And it took me, Frank, a long time, about 2 seconds to say, yes. And with that, I dropped my career in the academy and in the teaching world and zipped over to CBS. And they put me on an overnight shift working on radio copy for WCBS, a local station in New York. And I hadn't a clue as to what they were talking about.
Are you right?
They said, write the 5, the 5:30, the 6, and the 6:30. I said, fine. They said, have you ever done this? I said, no. And they didn't seem to think that was a problem, but I was terrified. I had no idea how to do one of these things. I really didn't.
Can we go back to the Murrow meeting for just a second?
Yeah.
What did you and he talk about for 3
We talked about
hours?
Right. Well, the article was about Soviet youth. And Murrow used that as a wedge to do a discussion of Soviet society and the Soviet people. And we were talking essentially about more than 100 different kinds of people that composed the Soviet population. The largest, of course, was the Russian group. And he was interested in their religion, how they worked, where they lived, that they got married, what happened to in-laws. He wanted to know about money. He was intensely interested. We have to remember, Frank, also, we were in the middle of the Cold War. That was one of the most dangerous periods in the history of this country in terms of our relationship with the communist world. We believed at that time that the world was divided definitely into 2 parts. There was the communist part, and there was, quote, the free world. And the United States led the free world. And Murrow led, I think I can say this accurately, led the broadcasting industry.
Yeah.
And he wanted very much to know as much as he could about the adversary, America's principal adversary during the Cold War. And he also was intent, I didn't know this at the time, he was intent on getting a CBS correspondent in Moscow who spoke Russian, who had lived there, who might have known the Soviet leadership, or at least some knowledge of the leadership. He was intent particularly on someone who spoke the language. He considered, and I must say I totally agree with him, he considered the reporter who went into a country without the knowledge of the language was immediately shortchanged. That if you had the language, you can actually pick up a conversation with
And
me.
you were fluent in Russian?
I was fluent is a rich word for me. I was very good at Russian. I spoke it quite well, and I understood almost everything.
And it had, I mean, this was not completely out of the blue because your brother was a journalist,
Yes.
so you knew that. Your mother was from Russia, right? So she
Well,
had
Ukraine, but yes.
Ukraine, sorry, Soviet Union at the time, but
Right, right.
And had you wanted, was this a dream of yours to be a reporter and to be in Moscow and to do this sort of thing?
Once in the back of my mind, I had always harbored the hope that I could get into journalism, because I regarded journalism then and since as one of the most exciting professions you could have. You're right smack in the middle of the world. You're asked every day to do something new. And even if it's old, it's a new angle on something that is new. It is an incredibly exciting profession. My brother was a reporter at the New York Times. He was covering Southeast Asia. I read his copy. I was terribly excited about the whole thing. And yet, most of my preparation for the life that I ultimately led was in scholarship, in the idea of studying Russian, the language and all of that. So for me, when Murrow said, would you like to? What happened is that I immediately cut off one whole part of my life, but absorbed the knowledge that I had picked up and put it into journalism.
Had you ever studied journalism?
No.
All right, so you'd never studied journalism. You have 3.5 hours of conversation with Edward R. Murrow. He hires you. You show up at CBS Radio, and you write in the book the most extraordinary thing about writing for Edward R. Murrow.
Yes. Yeah, what happened was that after I had done it for about 6 months, I began to collect information about the Soviet Union. And I distributed it to anchormen at CBS. I was working on the assumption that I knew about the Soviet Union. I had knowledge I wanted to share. And here were people who were on the air every single day, several times, talking about the Soviet Union, but really just reading it off the AP copy or Reuters. And I felt I could add something. And so I began to distribute a memo to the anchor people each week saying, this is what I think is important. So you might want to think about doing a piece on this. Murrow read it, a wonderful reporter, anchorman named Blair Clark, who did a program called The World Tonight, which was an analysis program. He also liked it, and Blair did it first, and then Murrow did. He invited me in one day when Gamal Abdel Nasser, the Egyptian leader, arrived in Moscow, was greeted by Nikita Khrushchev, and Murrow called me in and he said, there has never been a meeting like this between an Arab leader and Khrushchev before. Has there? I said, no. He said, I tell you what, write it for me. Do my analysis tonight. I said, tonight? He said, tonight.
Edward R. Murrow is saying, I mean, this is just and you've been there 6 months.
Yeah, and I did it. Now, obviously, I was terrified that he would throw it out after he read it.
Were you really?
Because I'd never done anything like this.
This was stressful.
But very much so. And I went into an office and I listened to his 7:45 program every night. But on this particular night, when I had handed him the script and I didn't know what was going to happen, however, I got a hint, because just before he went on the air, his writer, a wonderful man named Ed Bliss, came out of the studio and found me sitting there, and he put his finger up like this. So I assumed it was going to be read. But would he read it? Had he edited it? Had he torn out this or that part of it? I didn't know. I went into a private office, turned on the radio, and listened to his reading of my words. And I broke into tears. I broke down that instant because I couldn't quite absorb the idea that I had written something that Edward R. Murrow chose to read in his name on the CBS radio network. That was, Frank, as you can well imagine yourself, that was a huge moment for me. It was a launching pad, and I bless the memory of Murrow. He did it.
And I should point out that you were the last of the Murrow boys. You were the last reporter at CBS that he hired. He wasn't done with you because he tried to hire you separately another time, and I'll get to that in a minute. But let's get to the guts of your memoir and a lot of what you write about, which is the Soviet Union. This is a time of the Berlin Wall. This is the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is the time of summits, both failed and hopeful, mostly failed. And I want to ask about the failed summit, 1960. Khrushchev goes to Paris, de Gaulle is there, and Eisenhower goes. And there's a lot of drama in the world as to what's going to happen, because we've had the U-2, for those of us watching, the spy plane shot down over the Soviet Union, and Gary Powers is being held. And it's a very, very tense time. And you're a correspondent now, and I'm reading this book, and I get to this section and I can't put it down because you say, "Oh, I'm going to go talk to Khrushchev."
Well, no, come on. I didn't know that I was going to talk to him, but
you said, "I'm going to go try."
I'm going to try. And what happened was that Ralph Passman, the foreign editor, when I raised the idea, and it was raised, by the way, because I knew from former experience that when Khrushchev went to a foreign country, what he always did on the first morning was get up early and take a walk in the city that he was in. And I asked Passman, give me a crew. I'll go to the Russian embassy, the Soviet embassy. I'll be there very early in the morning. It may be a waste of time, but I think it's a good idea, and let's give it a shot. Passman didn't want to do it. But David Schoenbrunn, our correspondent in Paris, who was a fabulous personality, he turned to Passman and said, why not? Let's let him do it. And it was a little bit like, let's get the kid something and let him try it. And so the kid, me, met the crew the following day at 6 o'clock in front of the Soviet embassy.
And you could just be there, you were just literally in front of the Soviet embassy.
Right in front of the embassy. It was on the Rue de Grenelle. And there were very few cars there at that time. And the crew was set up. There was no other crew there. At 7 o'clock, big doors of the Soviet embassy open. Khrushchev emerges with 2 bodyguards. And I see him, and I begin to rush toward him with my crew. The 2 bodyguards, sensing a danger to Khrushchev, step in front and begin to reach into their pocket for, obviously, a weapon. And Khrushchev looks at me and he said, no, no, no. He said, there's Peter the Great. He's fine. And a quick story here, which you'll bear with me. Peter the Great was the name that Khrushchev gave me as a nickname in 1956 when we were discussing, believe it or not, basketball. And he asked me how tall I was. And I said, I'm 3 centimeters shorter than Peter the Great. And he loved the answer. He began to laugh, everybody laughed, and he began to call me Peter the Great. So when I met him that morning in Paris, May 17th, 1960, he recognized me. I saw him, and in my eyes, I said, story, big time story. And we began to walk down the street. We
2 of you walking down
the street. The 2 alone and the crew sort of walking with us. And I started by asking him a couple of simple questions, not important things. At that moment, we came upon a boulangerie, a French bakery, and the sniff, we both stood there for a moment in magical absorption with the aroma of freshly baked croissant. Now, you've had that, and anyone who has had it realizes it is a special moment, even for Nikita Khrushchev. And he stopped, he sniffed. He said, very good. And I said, would you like one? Oh, yes. And I ran in and I got a couple of croissants for him and his people and me and my people. And he bit into the first one, Frank. It was like a kid biting into a bar of chocolate. He absolutely loved it. Очень вкусно, really delicious, he said. And I knew that the door opened at that point. And I began to ask him about the U-2 crisis, the Berlin crisis, whether we would have a disarmament agreement or not, by which time he had walked back to the Soviet embassy, walked in, doors closed. I had my first exclusive. CBS had a fabulous story with which to open the summit, which never opened, by the way. The following day, Khrushchev decided that because of the U-2, he was not going to participate in the summit, even though Eisenhower gave him an opportunity to do so. He turned it down.
But Eisenhower, neither was Eisenhower going to apologize, although he'd thought about that. You write about this in the book. Shows what an interesting, complicated moment it really was.
It was an incredibly difficult time and very important time, because if there had been a negotiation on Berlin, which was incredibly important to Khrushchev and to others as well.
This is before the wall goes up.
This was just before the wall went up. And it was so important to Khrushchev. He called it always a bone in my throat. He wanted to get rid of the bone. He wanted to get rid of the Western occupation, as he saw it, of West Berlin. And that was a moment, and it didn't happen. And it was a terrible thing for the whole world, in fact.
Marvin, you were in Moscow with your wife, Mady, who, by the way, was a reliable brain trust for you, an editor.
Sure was.
And you had a remarkable time there. What was the most difficult or the tensest moment and story that you covered?
Well, in the period of time that I'm talking about in this book, in a funny kind of way, it was the death of Boris Pasternak, the great Soviet poet and the author of Dr. Zhivago, this book that, when it came out in 1958, was an explosive, a sensational story, because there was a great Russian writer saying that the Russian Revolution was a moment of setback, not advance, that it was a crisis for so many Russian people, that the lead character in the book, Dr. Zhivago, was not in any way anti-Russian, but he was anti-communist. And he very much would have liked to retreat to the Tsarist period. And for the Russian people, this was a moment when Khrushchev appeared to be a savior, appeared to be a reformer. He was going to open the doors of tyranny and allow the Russian people to breathe, finally, to breathe after the dictatorship, the 29-year-long dictatorship of Joseph Stalin. And for Khrushchev to slam the door so viciously on a great writer set the Russian people back very considerably. And in a funny kind of way, I never met Pasternak, but I had read him, and he was so great. And he had written a book. So what? Would the book, the publication of the book, have torn down the Soviet Union? No. And many, many years later, Khrushchev acknowledged that he made a terrible mistake, and he should really have allowed the book to be published.
I want to ask you a couple more questions about Soviet Union and Russia, a couple questions about journalism, and then get to the audience questions in a few minutes. Marvin, I pulled the following from the Associated Press today. Today, President Joe Biden will hold a summit with Russian President Vladimir Putin next month in Geneva, a face-to-face meeting between the two leaders that comes amid escalating tensions between the United States and Russia in the first months of the Biden administration. The leaders will discuss the full range of pressing issues as we seek to restore predictability and stability to the US-Russia relationship, the White House press secretary said in announcing the summit. So much has changed and so little has changed.
Right.
What is the story today, Marvin, between Russia and the United States as these leaders are yet again about to go to the summit?
Well, they're about to go to the summit, and I frankly would have preferred that they go to the summit much sooner than they are, but this is what has happened, and this is the reality that we live with. The relationship is very interesting, and the two words that you use that are key: predictability and stability. It was believed widely in Washington, that during the period of President Trump, in that 4-year period, the idea of predictability was really thrown out the window. And with it came the idea of stability in the relationship. These are two nations who have the greatest concentration of nuclear power in the world. And if you do not have stability and you cannot predict more or less the way your enemy, your adversary, is going to respond to a challenge, you are living in an incredibly dangerous world. That is the world that I think we exist in now, but we're not geared for that. We are geared for unpredictability, and I praise the White House and the president for seeking predictability, because without it, we're going to be in even worse trouble, I think, than we're in right now.
Marvin, you're a student of Russian history. You were getting your PhD in it, as we've discussed before you went, and you covered the Soviet Union,
Yes.
Watched it ever since. I was a White House correspondent, was there when President Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. We saw something happen that we never would have imagined happened, and all of this. But from your study of their history and your witnessing of the history during your correspondency and your lifetime, are the Russians capable of change?
Frank, that is one of the best questions I've been asked since I was promoting this book. When I was in Moscow in this period of time, in the early part of 1960, the one question on my mind that I couldn't quite answer was this: Khrushchev was trying to reform a communist system. Was it possible to reform a totalitarian structure of government? Was it possible slowly to eliminate the ugliness of totalitarianism within a framework of Russian history? We're talking not just about today, but going back 1,000 years. Is that possible? And the answer that I got at the end of this particular tour, I went there for another tour, the answer I got then in my mind was no. And it's no, you cannot really reform a dictatorship. You can eliminate it by eliminating the dictator. Then you have an opportunity. For example, when Gorbachev came into power in 1985, he had an opportunity, which he seized, of trying to reform a communist system. He failed. And with his failure came the end of his rule. And one of the failures was that if you have a system of government that is used to a system of totalitarianism, a place where the Russian people have never, except for brief slices of time, never really had an opportunity to govern themselves, to be a democracy. I think today, the answer to your question, my judgment would be no, it's not going to happen. It's not possible. There are not enough people who are prepared to take on the hard power that Putin represents. I mean, hard power. He's got the army, he's got the secret police, he's got the police itself, he's got all of the elements of power, and he can crush all of the Navalny's who might arise.
And he has shown
he's got the power
and a willingness to do it. And look at what's happening in Belarus now.
Yeah, exactly.
Contagious.
Exactly.
Okay, well, we're talking about Marvin's latest book, Assignment Russia, Becoming a Foreign Correspondent in the Crucible of the Cold War, which is fascinating stuff. Let's open the conversation to some questions from the floor. And if I'm not mistaken, I think Walter Reich would like to go first. Walter, if you're there, turn your camera on and please proceed with your question for Marvin. Hi, Walter. Welcome back.
Oh, thank you. I just want to say, Marvin, that as I read each chapter, which you sent to me as you finished it, and was just excited waiting to get the next chapter, I realized that I was reading a love letter to America. I was reading a person describing an important moment in a career that's truly remarkable, whose father had come from Poland in 1914, whose mother had come from Ukraine in 1917.
1913. 1913, but go ahead, please.
I know all this from this paper, which is actually a lecture that you gave at the Holocaust Museum.
Yes.
When I was its director. And it's the journalism of the Holocaust. And you talked about your family, and you talked about how almost all of their relatives had been killed. Your father came, he was a tailor in the Bronx, and he raised two boys and a girl. The two boys had remarkable journalistic careers, and you did what you did as described in the book and in so much else. And I'm just struck by this love letter. And is it just me who felt that, or was it in your mind?
Well, it was very, very much in my mind, but I felt awkward simply saying it in the way that you have. I wanted it to come through in the book itself. I wanted there to be a story of a young man who made it. And he made it because he was an American living in a country where economic opportunity and political freedom was valued, cherished. And when my father came here, my mother came here, they came from places where that did not exist. And I wanted with this book, in a way, to pay back America and to say thank you for what it is that you did for my mother and for my father. And you didn't do this directly for me, but I'm the product of that environment. And I am deeply grateful to this country for having given my father that kind of welcome. He never made a great deal of money. He was a tailor, as you said. Money was tough to come by. But he always believed in this country, and he stuck that in my mind, and I have always believed it. And even though there are many difficulties, we're all aware of them, we've all covered those stories, nevertheless, this is an exceptional place, and we ought to be very, very grateful for it. And this is simply my way of saying thanks.
Thanks, Walter. I'm going to follow up on Walter's question and that theme, Marvin, with you for a moment, because I mentioned earlier that Edward R. Murrow offered you another job at one point. And
Yes.
that job was when he was leading the US Information Agency. And he offered you a chance, a moment, not just to work with him again, but to serve your country. And that was a very dramatic moment for you.
It was an incredibly difficult time. Murrow became the head of USIA, and in March of 1961, Ambassador Tommy Thompson called me into his office in Moscow, and he showed me a letter that Murrow had sent to me through the diplomatic pouch. The letter said that he wanted to have a confidential conversation with me. I had the clue as to what was on his mind. Why would he have a conversation with me? He was a top official in the US government. I'm a reporter in Moscow. What is that all about? And so I asked the ambassador, I said, you read the letter. What's going on here? He said, I don't know, call him. And Mady and I realized instantly he couldn't make the call from Moscow, so we went to Paris. And I called him, and Murrow, in his way, and then quite directly, offered me a job to be his deputy at his right arm for the study of all communist problems relating to the United States. That was a phenomenal offer. I mean, in a way, it was like the offer he made to me in 1957 to join CBS. It was to be a huge leap up in the US government and to try to help the US government with my knowledge of Russia. And I was blown away first by the opportunity that he had presented to me. This was a phenomenal thing. I mean, it was phenomenal for me anyway.
Sure.
And Mady and I went up and down the streets of Paris trying to figure out whether I can accept this or reject it. And her response to me was, you must reject it because you are now doing what you've always wanted to do as a correspondent. You're in Moscow, you've made it. So enjoy it in a way, cover the story that you've always wanted to cover. And I said, but Murrow wants me. How do I say no to Murrow? Who the heck am I?
Right.
Well, I'd get overwhelmed. The point is, I decided that I wanted to do what Murrow did during World War II. I wanted to cover the story. And so the following morning, I called him back. I said, no, I can't do it. And please understand the context. And he said he did. And I sent him a note the following day, a letter explaining yet again why I couldn't do it, that I wanted to do what he did. And he sent me a note back saying that he appreciated my letter and he did understand why I said no to him. But deep down in my heart, to this day, I don't know whether I did the right thing at all. But you know, look, I could have joined him, and maybe after he left the government, I could have gone back to being a journalist. In other words, it would not have been the end of a career.
Maybe.
Maybe, but I didn't know.
And
I decided I wanted to be a journalist more than anything else at that time in my life.
I'm going to say that you served your country and you served all of us well by doing
Oh, you're kind.
A couple questions from the audience. Here's one. Marvin, is there any video footage we could see of Mr. Kalb walking down the street in Paris with N.S. Khrushchev?
I wish I had that footage, but CBS did not, in its utter, I don't want to say stupidity, but whatever the word is. Until 1968, they did not keep the footage of the CBS Evening News or the CBS Morning News. They simply dumped it. And so this footage, the answer is no, it doesn't exist.
There's no footage, there's no film of you eating a croissant with Nikita Khrushchev.
No, because we were the only ones there. And that, I mean, you know, it's great for journalism.
Your crew was there.
Yeah, my crew was there, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that was it. So anyway, the answer is no, unfortunately. That's a great question.
Another question from our audience. David asks, can you talk about your coverage during the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Yes, that was an incredibly, as you can well imagine, incredibly dramatic. My boss had told me that I could send Mady out of the country, but I stay behind. And the coverage was sort of 24-hour day, as you can imagine. But the Russians, who were the other principal characters in this particular drama, they wanted the story to come out of Moscow as they saw it, not as I would report it. And what I tried to do every morning was to go to the central marketplace and talk to peasants about what they thought was happening, just to get a feel about what the Russian people were thinking. And the remarkable thing, Frank, they did not believe that Cuba was important at all to Russia. They didn't know what Khrushchev was doing, fooling around in Cuba. Why don't we stay here and deal with our own problems? Who cares about missiles to Cuba? It's not important. In other words, the Russian people conveyed a very logical, for them, response to the crisis itself. And when I was broadcasting this kind of thing, it was very much in opposition to the reported move of the US government coming out of Washington, because we were there talking about kids ducking under their desks, talking about the imminence of nuclear war. The Russian people did not see it that way. I don't think that Khrushchev saw it that way until the very end of the week, when he realized that this was getting close to an exchange of nuclear weapons. He didn't want that. He always said in a nuclear war, the living would envy the dead.
Yeah.
He realized how awful it would be. And fortunately, we had Kennedy on one side, Khrushchev on the other, and they worked their way out.
I want to ask you about this. It's fascinating. Follow up. One of the most amazing interviews I did was for a documentary I was doing on the Cuban Missile Crisis for the History Channel. And I had an opportunity to interview Robert McNamara.
Yeah.
And he talked about coming out of the White House on the Saturday night in the a moment and standing on West Executive Drive before going through the gates, looking up in the sky. And he claimed this anyway. He said this to me. I wondered if this was the last Saturday night I would see. This is the defense secretary having just met with the American president. Was there that sense in Moscow that we were that close to a nuclear exchange?
No, there was not. What was interesting, that is that Saturday night before the crucial Sunday when we got a report that Khrushchev had decided to withdraw the missiles. On that Saturday night, the problem for the United States was that Kennedy faced a very clear decision that the following day, as a result of surveillance that would be done overnight, he would have to make a decision about whether to attack Cuba and get rid of those missiles or somehow or another pull back. And there was a very active set of diplomatic exchanges. And on Sunday at about 3 p.m. Moscow time, I was at the Central Telegraph preparing to do a broadcast when a Russian reporter from Radio Moscow ran in to the telegraph office and screamed something to the censor. And I overheard what he said. And what he said was, there's going to be a big announcement at 3 p.m. Remember that. And I ran out of the booth, caught him, asked him what big announcement. He said, we're in the middle of a crisis, right? I said, yes. We're either going to war or there's going to be peace. And he smiled. He smiled, which was for me a feeling that it was going to be a break in favor of a peaceful resolution. And I ran back and told the people in New York, but not to put it on the air, but just be alert to that strong possibility. And at exactly 3 o'clock, the great voice of Radio Moscow, sort of the Murrow of Russia, came on, and he read the statement about the pullback. And as he read it, I put it on the air direct to CBS in New York and reported that the Russians had caved. I use that verb.
Wow.
Kennedy, when he heard it, was furious. And he called Schönbrunn, who was the bureau chief in Washington, and he said, tell your reporter in Moscow never to use a word like that. It'll humiliate Khrushchev. You can't do that. And Schönbrunn pointed that out to me, and I used the verb again and again because that is what Khrushchev did. He caved to American pressure. It was a story that you have to live through to fully sort of, I get chills when I even think about it.
I get chills too. And I'm sorry, I'm going to give it away. I was in second grade, so we were playing duck and cover in the hallway. This is how we were going to. All right, another question. Another question from our audience. John writes, please discuss the end of the Cold War, 1989 to 91. There was a massive change, and it was almost completely peaceful. How surprising was that?
Incredibly surprising. And we have to thank Gorbachev, the leader of Russia, for that kind of peaceful resolution. The key question, it's a funny kind of thing. Khrushchev at the May summit in 1960 referred to Berlin as the bone in my throat. It was always Berlin. It was always Germany. Why? Because for Russia, the Germans, the Teutons, they were the people who had been responsible for many invasions, and the Russians have never forgotten that. So for them, Berlin, Germany was always the key. The question for the West was, can we unify Berlin, unify, in a sense, all of Germany, keep it within NATO, and get the Russians to buy into that? That was a huge thing for Gorbachev to do, but he did it. And once he did it, the door was open then to an opportunity, which we have seized upon, to try very hard to end the Cold War and to end thereby the opportunity of communism as, in my judgment, a lousy system of government to be spread to other parts of the world.
Another question from the audience, and this circles back, I guess, on something we were talking about earlier, whether the Russians have the capacity to change. So Jeff asks, do you have hope for the Russian people becoming democratic in this century?
Oh, do I have hope? Yes, I'm an optimist. I have hope, but I'm also, I think, a bit of a realist. And as I was saying earlier, the Russian people have lived with an authoritarian form of government for most of their lives. There was a time in the tail end of the 19th century when there was an opening up and people thought maybe the Russians would move significantly westward in their political philosophy. But then the mini revolution of 1905 started, and then the big revolution of 1917, and that whole movement was crushed. Then in the 1990s, there was the Yeltsin period, when there was the belief that maybe somehow democracy can come to Russia. And now we have Putin, and he is systematically, day by day, crushing whatever opportunity for democracy did exist in Russia. So is it possible? Yes, everything is possible. Is it likely? No. And it's not likely because it just is not part of the history of the country. They don't quite feel it. But I must say, the Russians can fool us. They are an amazingly, in many ways, creative people. Think about this. If you go to a concert, you're going to listen to Russian music. If you pick up a book, the likelihood is that you're going to read something by Tolstoy, right? Dostoevsky, yes. The dancing, you go to a ballet, it is Russian. In other words, the Russians have it within them to be great and perhaps democratic, but that's difficult. In the 19th century, a number of writers yearned for democracy, but they only found it when they went on their trips to Western Europe. And people like Turgenev or Herzen lived in Western Europe and refused to go back to Russia because they loved the feeling of living in a democratic state.
We've talked about you, and we've talked about the Soviet Union and Russia and a number of other things. Let's spend a few minutes talking about journalism.
Okay.
You know, if your book is a love letter to America, it's also a love letter to journalism.
Well, I hope so.
And for those of us who may remember some names I'm going to share that you write about are legends. And for those who may not remember, for people who are younger who are part of this conversation, I would urge you to go Google them and look them up and listen to their voices if you can find them. Marvin, you write about Dallas Townsend and Robert Trout, and Howard K. Smith and Douglas Edwards and Richard C. Hottelet, who I grew up from just down the street, and Charles Perrault, who was a poet and showed us what we could, the magic that we could do with pictures. And you quote Edward R. Murrow for all of those wonderful people in this very speech, this very famous speech he gave, which you quote, saying this nation is in mortal danger because he said television is failing to do its job. And he said it can teach, it can illuminate, it can even inspire, but only if human beings are determined to use it to those ends. And the words, right, which we remember so well, and you quote, otherwise it is merely wires and lights in a box. You and I, it's not exactly a box, but we're staring into the equivalent of a box right now. And this magical thing, the internet and social media and all the rest, can do all those things that Murrow talked about all those years ago. But what do you make of this thing we call journalism today?
What I make of it is that it is as essential at its core as it has always been. You go back to the Bible and they talk about scribes, people who wrote down what it is that the leader wanted, and then you go on a mountaintop and through horns or whatever, pass a message on to the next group of people living beyond that mountaintop. You always need somebody to pass on the information. We today have a phenomenal technological capacity to report on anything going on in the world and do it live. Frank, when you started, I don't believe that there was that full live capacity, but we certainly did not have it in my time. Everything had to be thought through, measured, checked, double checked. Then you went on the air and you passed that information on. Today, because it's live, you don't have that opportunity to check or double check. You just talk. Now, hopefully, you know what you're saying. But an awful lot of people, I am reluctant to say, do not know that much about what they're saying. And so bad information goes out, or impressions that are not balanced. You know, people today are saying, oh, you're a liberal, or you work for Fox, and that makes you a conservative and all of that. And unfortunately, that's true. In the political environment in which we live today, journalists who should be above the fray, looking down, reporting it as best they can, are part of the fray. Fox is now a part of the political warfare in this country. And let's say, and it's not quite accurate to do this, but let's say on the other side, there's MSNBC, which is not the equivalent of Fox. But on MSNBC, you have a different point of view, a more liberal point of view. And people on the right look at the left and say, you can't trust them. People on the left look at the right, say the same thing, at which point our society is being split right down the middle. And I think that President Biden is absolutely correct when he says that this country today faces a split between democratic forces and on the other side, a drifting toward authoritarianism. The Republican Party today has a lot of answers to give to questions that are being asked by any number of people who do not recognize the Republican Party. I remember covering at Meet the Press, you would sit there with a Republican senator who is a perfectly sensible man who would give you a position that made perfect sense, even if you didn't agree with it. But you could tell he was seeking, we had a common basis in fact, in truth, which we don't appear to have today. Without that, how do we govern in a democracy? That's why I think your question leads me, forgive me, into this spiel about our democracy today. We go back to Murrow, for example. I once asked him, what is the definition of democracy? And he passed the buck to an Oxford Don. I have a feeling it was Isaiah Berlin, but I'm not sure. And he said that that Don described democracy as having two fundamental pillars. If those pillars remain strong, the structure of democracy at the top of it also remains strong. One pillar is the law, the justice, which is fundamental to democracy. You must have an equal appreciation of the law. And on the other side was a press that is free. If either one of those pillars is weakened, the entire structure of democracy is weakened. And we know from what has happened in the last 4 or 5 years that the law, which is fundamental, and there are many fabulous lawyers and judges who did brave things in the last 6 months, but the structure is weakened. And on the right, the press. It should not be at war. It should be covering the news, but it's at war, and that makes it weak, and people don't trust what they're saying.
What, I don't know if there is a Marvin Kalb, a 27-year-old Marvin Kalb today. I don't know that a 27-year-old Marvin Kalb would find the journalism ecosystem even remotely similar to what you experienced. So there is today's reality. So what do you say to today's 27-year-old aspiring journalist who's got the Marvin Kalb curiosity and drive and intellect? What should she do?
I think that what she should do is go into the field of journalism and remember what the central purpose of journalism is. Give me the news. Give me the news nice and straight and clean. And don't tell me, Murrow used to say quite often, don't tell me what you think, tell me what you know. And that has always stuck in my mind too. Don't tell me, oh, I think this is happening. No, I want to know what you know. And tell that young lady, whether she's 27 and she won't admit it, that the important thing right now is just give us the news, straight, clean, unattached to politics. Just give me what's happening and make sure you got it right. It's the greatest profession in the world, Frank. You know it, and I know it, and I wish more people.
I'm going to give you 4 thank yous and turn it over to Chris. One, I want to thank you for writing the book. And again, I read it and took a lot of notes and underlined a lot of things. Fabulous.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for what you've brought to journalism, because it's been a lifetime contribution, and you are one of those legendary names. 3, I want to thank you for what you've done and brought to academia at the Shorenstein Center and elsewhere, and bringing your insight to so many people, and spending a little time with me to help me navigate here and there as well, Marvin. And finally, I want to thank you for the Kalb Report, which goes into its next season, and for you just being you. There are probably lots of people here who know you as a person, Marvin, and you are not only a wonderful journalist and a guy who writes a love letter to America, but you're a warm, wonderful person. And it's what makes you an incredibly special experience. So thank you for all those things, and for a fabulous conversation. And Chris, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Frank. You've been just beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, there have been many thanks here, and so I will be brief. Thanks to Frank and to Marvin Kalb for just a wonderful, spellbinding conversation. We've all learned so much and are in your debt. And thanks to Walter and the Rabin Chair Forum and the Institute for European, Russian and Eurasian Studies, and the LEAP Initiative has just been delighted to host this event today. And finally, thanks to all of our attendees who have joined today. And we are all better for today's discussion. So, and thanks to the School of Media and Public Affairs that Frank led so well for so long. And at that point, I will say so long and thank you all so much. Bye now.